All right, Brian, we are recording now. How are you doing today?
Great, man. It's nice to see you again.
Yeah, likewise. I'm going to give you a little intro here and you tell me if I leave anything out. But everybody, today we have acclaimed documentarian Brian Dobbs. So Brian is the creative force behind the groundbreaking documentary Blue Planet Red, a visually stunning and thought-provoking exploration of Mars, its controversial anomalies, and the possibility that the red planet may hold more secrets than we've been led to believe. With background in investigative filmmaking and a passion for uncovering hidden truths, Brian brings a fresh cinematic lens to the planetary enigma that is Mars and the larger questions they raise about humanity's place in the cosmos. Brian, you're also a musician, correct?
That's right.
All right. Did I leave anything out there?
No, that's pretty much it, man.
All right. I've watched your documentary, and I got to say, it is very well done. It is super entertaining, informative, and you make a fantastic case for life on Mars. Let's just say it. And we're going to parse this out, and we're going to dig right into it. But how's everything going?
Good, man. And I appreciate that. I thank you for reaching out, Matt, and connecting with me and taking an interest in this subject. I think I was telling you before that I think Mars disclosure seems like the redheaded stepchild of the disclosure movement, really. We'll get into the weeds, of course, but just right off the bat, the case for life on Mars, the case for current microbial life, and the case for past intelligent life on Mars, all of this information was presented by people much earlier in time, and it was scattered among a variety of different people. I simply connected all the dots because it was shocking to me that no one had put out a film of this type that presented all of the anomalous areas of study and research that has been published thus far in one narrative, in one cohesive piece. It turns out that there's a lot of people working on Mars from a variety of backgrounds, PhDs, academics, aerospace industry, independent researchers, but they're all siloed. They don't talk to one another. That's the problem. The scientists, it's like they just know their one thing and they do it really well, and they don't necessarily want to get into anything else. So me being agnostic here, I'm saying, look, there's a whole story, but taking any one thing in particular, it's not enough, I think, to compel the public to gain a mainstream appeal, to gain an interest in this subject. And I simply said, look, there's a story to tell here. I'm surprised no one's done it. People have done it in slivers, but in totality, I felt like I had something to offer that hadn't been done before. It's really a story that has been told by other people. I just grabbed them all and put them together to try to make it a nice package for the layperson, for the uninitiated.
Yeah, and you do a great job with that. And I don't think we can state enough the credentialed individuals that you do speak to. These aren't just UFO researchers, hobbyists. These are credentialed, PhD'd, high-level individuals with decades of experience in their fields. And like you said, you've brought them all together and said, hey, look, you've got this giant piece of the puzzle. This guy's got this giant piece of the puzzle. And when you start to put this together, you make an extremely compelling case for this argument. So if you're ready, I'd like to dig right in if we can.
Yeah, man. Let's dig in.
All right. So let's talk about panspermia. Can you explain to us what is panspermia? What is this idea of panspermia? And what is this?
Panspermia offers an explanation for the distribution of life in the universe. It does not offer an explanation for its origin. We don't really know how life began. But in terms of seeding galaxies, seeding planetary systems, if there are microbes here on Earth, and let's say a comet or an asteroid or meteor impact smashes down on the surface of the Earth and Earth ejects a bunch of material out into space. Some of that microbial life embedded deeply in rocks or the crust of the Earth gets ejected out into space, and maybe it finds a different planetary body and falls there. And presuming that it survives the impact, which a microbe could, inside of a meteorite, then there's a chance for that microbe to adapt to a different planetary body's conditions and then seed life on a different planetary body. So it is a very well-known hypothesis that was essentially popularized by an individual known as Chandra Wickramasinghe and others, but he is one of the more well-known living today. And this film, it offers examples of panspermia. And it's not something that I think most mainstream scientists are aware of. They're aware of the hypothesis, but they're not even aware of the evidence. And believe it or not, there is evidence which we present in the film, even specifically as it relates to Mars.
Yeah, and that's where I wanted to go next. So I guess a couple of the examples you talk about are the Allen Hills meteorite of 1984, and I believe it's called the Argyle meteorite. Do you want to touch on these two? And
Yes.
because 1984 wasn't the first one. There's previous examples, but why don't we start there since that was on the too far distant past?
Yes, you mentioned the most well-known example of a microfossil in a meteorite is what you just said, what is known as the Allen Hills meteorite, which was discovered by a NASA team of scientists in Antarctica in 1984. And what are we talking about? Microfossil. It's a microorganism, but it's a fossilized microorganism. And this team discovered it in 1984, but then it took them about a decade to start looking at the interior and examining its contents. And what they discovered was essentially organic material and what appeared to be little tiny critters, little tiny bacteria, microbacteria. This research was performed at NASA and created such an intense firestorm in a good way that eventually, long story short, news of this research reached the White House and ultimately led Bill Clinton to do an entire press conference on the White House lawn in 1996. And there's a video clip of this in the film. So imagine you're a scientist and you publish a paper and the President of the United States goes out of his way and schedules a press conference about this. So this is the most well-known example of a microfossil in a meteorite. And most of the public who paid any attention to this, even a lot of scientists, thought that this was the first and only example. Now, through the process of making Blue Planet Red, and I got to credit my partner, Michael Craig from England, who has been studying this a lot longer than I have. And he was essentially my mentor and my subject matter expert. He pointed me in the direction of a few different people, such as the Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe in Wales. He was a native Sri Lankan, but he's in the UK right now. And another individual, Professor Richard Hoover, who was the lead astrobiologist at the NASA Marshall Space Flight Center until his retirement in 2012. And both of them present examples of microfossils found earlier than the Allen Hills meteorite. And in my opinion, Matt, these are much better examples because they are more clearly defined even to the untrained eye. I don't know how anybody can take a look at what they have found and they have published on. And we're talking about, okay, the lead astrobiologist at NASA Marshall Space Flight Center publishing about dozens of meteorites containing microfossils in them. And there's pictures. I was sitting down, I went to go interview him. We went out to lunch, and I said, Professor Hoover, if there only was a picture of these microfossils that you talk about, and he just looks at me and he laughs, huh. And he whips out his iPad right then and there and shows me an image. And if you would permit me, Matt, I can share.
Yeah.
I can do a share screen so people can know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
What, in my opinion, are the best examples of what are known as microfossils in a different meteorite, which was a meteorite known as the Orgueil meteorite that fell in France in 1864. So I can show it if you want.
Show it.
Matt, can you see these things here?
I can see these things. So diatoms, is that what we're looking at?
Yes. Now yes, we are looking at what is known as a diatom microfossil. Now, what the heck is a diatom? This was new to me, but apparently a diatom is a very common plant microscopic. It's a microscopic plant, essentially.
Is it like algae?
They're responsible for producing half of the Earth's oxygen. And they're responsible for the smell of the sea, as Professor Richard Hoover describes. So it is a very common and well-known critter. And here we see, to me, this is undeniable. I don't know how anyone looks at this and says, oh, no, that's just part of the rock.
Yeah, no, that's an organism of some kind.
It's life when you see it.
Sure.
And now, his critics will say this was just contaminated. This fell down and a diatom jumped into it, which is nonsense because
they're saying it like crawled into the center of this rock where they extracted these photos from.
yes.
Okay, keep going.
So not only that, but Professor Hoover has, and I don't use this word lightly, proven that it's not the product of terrestrial contamination, because if it was terrestrial, there would be nitrogen content in these fossils, and there is no nitrogen content. There's also missing amino acids and missing something called nucleobases. It's complicated. I can't quite keep up with it, but there are things that are missing that would indicate it is a terrestrial organism, that it was alive recently. So because there are these things that are missing, especially the nitrogen, mean it's been dead for a very long time. We're talking thousands, if not millions of years. So how does something crawl into it that doesn't have those biosignatures? Maybe that's not the right word, but they don't have those markers for something that was living even recently. And I'm just looking at these things. It's undeniable. To the untrained eye, I'm like, Jesus, this is so much better of an example than the Allen Hills meteorite, which kind of looks like a little worm, and some people are like, I don't really know. Right. Why are we not talking about this?
Yeah, that's pretty compelling evidence that something that was a living organism that was found inside of a rock that came from space, landed on Earth, and then cracked it open, and here you go.
So that was the Orgueil meteorite, and Chandra Wickramasinghe, he found this other diatom in a different meteorite known as the Polonnaruwa meteorite, which fell in Sri Lanka about 15 years ago. Now, let me just say that the Orgueil meteorite, why is the Orgueil meteorite relevant to our Mars discussion? It's because a different scientist, Dr. John Brandenburg, has published research regarding the Orgueil meteorite specifically, and based on its isotopic analysis, he has essentially derived that it originated from Mars. So here we have direct evidence that a meteorite came from Mars and contained little microorganisms in it. So essentially, this more or less provides very strong evidence that the swapping spit of these two planetary bodies occurred, and perhaps occurred quite a bit.
Yeah, again, another huge piece of the puzzle, right? Showing that there's not only is there an organism that came from something from outside our atmosphere, but it's showing a signature that it most likely came from Mars. I'm wondering if you've spoken to anybody that talks about the likelihood that most of these things coming into our atmosphere could be from Mars, because it is so close to us, relatively speaking. Have you had that conversation?
There are quite a number of meteorites that are in NASA's possession, okay, and in many academic institutions' possession, cataloged and archived and everything like that. Dr. John Brandenburg, his paper wasn't just about the Orgel meteorite, it was about a whole classification of a large swath of meteorites that he believes have been mislabeled. He believes that there's a whole number of meteorites that are in NASA's possession that were originated from Mars, but that have been mislabeled as coming from elsewhere.
Right.
So that's up for debate, but that's as close as I got.
Okay. I like to fast forward a little bit.
Yeah.
Could we talk about the labeled release experiment? Because this is a compelling piece of the puzzle that you present in there. First of all, can you tell everybody what is the labeled release, who invented it, and how it found its way onto the Viking missions?
Great question. So let's rewind the clock back to 1976. And a lot of kids these days, that's a long time ago, was for me as well. I was born in 81, but still, if it happens before you're born, you think that's old, that's history. Why should I even care? But here we have, in 1976, quite an ambitious mission that NASA planned and executed flawlessly, essentially, for all intents and purposes. In 1976, NASA launched 2 different rockets to Mars, each rocket containing a probe that would orbit Mars and a probe that would land on Mars. So that's essentially 4 different probes, 2 orbiters, 2 landers, Viking 1 and Viking 2. And on these landers, okay, the orbiters took photographs, okay, from space.
We'll get into that.
The landers themselves each contained life test experiments. A few of them, actually, 3 of them. One of them, the most consequential, was known as the labeled release experiment. Scientists and their names, whatever. What does that mean? It doesn't really matter at this point, just how it works. The labeled release experiment was designed by a guy named Dr. Gil Levin, who was essentially a sanitation engineer who had a PhD in microbes in water and environmental systems. He designed a system, he designed a test that could test soil and water for microbes before he even worked with NASA. So there was I'll try to make a long story short. He pitched NASA on this idea. Hey, I got this box. You're going to Mars. I got a box that can directly search for living microbes. It's not looking for building blocks. It's not looking for organic material. It's looking directly for microbes. And NASA sent 2 of these labeled release experiments aboard the Viking mission to Mars. And each labeled release experiment tested the soil for microbial metabolism. And what does that mean? It fed the soil some nutrient food, essentially a little chicken soup, as they called it. And they waited a few hours just to see what would happen. If gas was produced, because when living organisms ingest food, they ultimately produce
Smell.
they have metabolic processes, so they will release gas from that. And sure enough, this test detected a positive result on multiple occasions that metabolic activity was happening in the soil. So, as Dr. Gil Levin explains, they should have popped the champagne right then and said, we found life on Mars in 1976.
So can you talk about the efficacy of this test? Because this wasn't something they just sent there just to say, hey, let's just see if this works. This had been tested multiple times in different environments here on Earth, correct?
Yes, this test, as I understand it, was performed on Earth over 4,000 times and never produced a false positive nor false negative. So, in my opinion, I don't know what you call it, Matt, but that's a perfect test.
It sure seems like it. And so if you're going to send a test like this to Mars to see if there's evidence of metabolic microbial activity, then this would be what you would send.
Yes, and I'm glad you. Okay, so let's examine this word evidence because I want to be clear here. I use the word evidence in a strictly legal sense, where evidence meaning suggestive of. This is different than conclusive. This is different than proof. And I think so many scientists lose sight of that because they conflate the two terms. So when I say evidence, I'm talking about it is suggestive of. It is not proof. It is not conclusive, but it's strong evidence. There's weak evidence, there's strong evidence, but there's evidence.
Yeah. So again, another piece to this puzzle, this case that you're building,
Right.
that's a big, in my opinion, that's a big piece. Now, so obviously this came back as positive. What was the reaction? Did they say that, okay, we have evidence of this, or did they downplay it and say there was another reason for this? Why didn't we pop the champagne?
Ultimately, it was a head scratcher for NASA because there was a different test on Viking, one that was purposely designed to search for organic material in the soil. Okay, and this other test in 1976 did not find organic material in the soil, leading NASA to ask, rightfully, how does one have life, microbial life in the soil if there are no organics? So they said originally the life test results were inconclusive. Okay, due to the missing organics. So fast forward a few decades later, and they start sending these rovers that most people know, the Curiosity rover, Pathfinder, these sorts of things, and the latest one is Perseverance. But the Curiosity rover, over a decade ago, it found the organics that they couldn't find in 1976. Now, why couldn't they find them? As it turns out, the test that they sent in 1976 to look for organics in the soil was not sensitive enough. The technology simply wasn't there yet. And what makes it even more tragic is that they knew this test wasn't that good because when they tested it in the Antarctic, they tested the Antarctic soil for organics. It didn't find them there either, even though there are organics in the Antarctic soil. So the question is, why hasn't NASA revisited these results? In light of the new data, there are organics in the soil. Had they found them in 1976, I don't think they would have concluded that the results were inconclusive.
Sure. We might not be having this conversation had that been done. Now, are we talking about the gas spectrometer test? Is that what that is?
Yes, it's got a long, funky name, the gas chromatograph mass spectrometer.
Okay. Now, this is something they had tested on Earth. They knew that some of the results would be inconclusive, or at least they had instances here on Earth where this was going to be inconclusive, and yet they send this thing anyway.
Yes.
As another test.
Yes, and I want to credit here a friend of mine and a scientist in the film. His name is Barry DiGregorio. In the film, we don't get into the labeled release experiment, him and I, but later in one of the YouTube videos that you saw, Barry DiGregorio was the biographer of Dr. Gil Levin. So Barry DiGregorio, he has an entire book written about Gil Levin and his test, the labeled release experiment, and NASA's adoption of the test and the entire history, all of the developments that NASA had and Gil Levin had with this test. So a lot of this history, I have to credit Barry DiGregorio because he was essentially doing what I'm doing now, was essentially advocating for all these different, he wrote a book, and it is such a well-written book. It would actually make for a good drama, a good movie. Barry, if you're listening, kudos goes to him. He was just like you and me, Matt. He was just a curious individual who went to NASA one day and visited and started looking into this Viking stuff. And ultimately, long story short, he wrote a book on it. And I have a different medium. I do filmmaking, you do podcasting. But we have to credit these people who worked decades ago on documenting exactly what happened. And so if you want the full story, Barry's book is the one to get. It is a well-written book, and I love it.
Do you have the name of that book by any chance?
Yes, thank you. It's called Mars, the Living Planet. And if you want to, I got a link to it on my website, blueplanetred.net. It's such an amazing book. And for those people who are curious as to what the hell happened in 1976 with this whole Viking mission and the labeled release experiment, I don't know of any better source than this book.
Good. Awesome. Yeah, I'm definitely going to pick that one up because I kind of like to get into the weeds of this stuff. And if he wrote a whole book on just that, I'm sure it's quite compelling. So let's go to something else now, Brian. I want to talk about crinoids, and I hope I'm pronouncing that word correctly. Now, I've actually knew what this was, but I'd never heard the word before, crinoids. Can you tell everybody what is a crinoid? And if you have a photo that you want to pull up, that would probably be good. If not, I've got one. But what are crinoids?
Yes, for those people who don't know, crinoid is a funny word. It was a new word to me. And long story short, in 2004, let me take a step back. A crinoid is what I would describe as a flowery-looking starfish. They're an animal, a sea creature. Sometimes they're feathery and they kind of wave their arms and float around in the water. You can imagine this. Some other times they're what they call stalked. They have they're like a little tiny, they look like a plant, but it's actually an animal. And they're rooted in the sea floor, and they have a little stalk with, looks like a flower. So it's either moving around or it's tethered, I guess I should say. And in 2004, the Opportunity rover took a photograph of what appears to be a crinoid fossil on Mars. And I can share screen here, Matt. It's an interesting image for those who don't know what they're looking at. Let me just do a quick share here. Okay, so this is the original NASA image. Now you're seeing a section that's maybe about 18 inches here. Okay, it's the side of a rock that a rover took an image of. Can you see my mouse?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so the object in question is this right here, and let's see if I can zoom up on it here. Okay, so this particular thing right here looks like the stalk, the branch, or what's the trunk, I should say, the trunk of a crinoid. And you can see right here, it starts to split. All right. And it's not much. This whole thing here is about 3 or 4 inches big. It's not that big. And when you compare it to terrestrial crinoids, it shares characteristics. I took a look at this. I'm like, I don't know, maybe, sure. It looks like you could maybe make out what appears to be some sort of organic looking an organism. So I'm like, all right, let me vet this. First of all, these are all sourced from NASA websites. Okay, so the image is original. I took this image and I sent it to a paleontologist at the University of Cincinnati. And I asked him what he thought. I said, hey, here's an image of what do you make of this? It says, this looks like the fossil of a crinoid or a sea lily. I said, oh, okay. Then he said, where did you get this image? And I said, I got it from Mars. And I never heard back from him. Okay. But that was enough for me, Matt, to say, okay, here's an expert on crinoid fossils thinking this looks like a crinoid fossil. I'm like, okay, this is compelling stuff. So,
Peace.
oh, yeah. Anyway, so there's more to the story there. That's the setup there.
And the gentleman you had on the documentary, who is the foremost expert, even actually wrote, did he actually write the book on crinoids?
Ah, yes. I did find a crinoid, another crinoid fossil expert. He's essentially an amateur paleontologist, but since from early childhood, a gentleman by the name of Richard Keyes has been collecting crinoid fossils his entire life, thousands of them. He's got a whole storage unit, and his whole house is filled with these things. If there's anybody who knows what a crinoid fossil looks like, it's this guy. And I got lucky because he just so happened to be in Alabama, Huntsville, in the same area that Richard Hoover was in. And while I was down there in Huntsville, I said, hey, Richard Hoover, because Richard Hoover talks about this. He presented this. I said, hey, who was your buddy who was a crinoid expert? He's, that's my friend Richard. He's here in Huntsville. Do you want me to call him up? I said, yes. So he calls him up right then and there, and he's just available. So he comes down to the Space and Rocket Center there in Huntsville. I said, hey, buddy, let's put you on camera. Let's talk about this because I need to know what you thought about this. Now, he's pretty fair about it. He's, look, we don't know for certain, but if you're asking me, yeah, it looks like a crinoid fossil. Now, think about that, man. It's like we have a what is known as a macroscopic, visible to the naked eye fossil of what appears to be a little tiny critter here on Mars. And I keep coming back to the same question. Why haven't we followed up on that?
And that's not a microbial organism. That's more complex. This is something that you could touch and pick up. So now you're now you're in a different arena. Yeah, so like now you're in like a different arena. So you have microbial life. I think people could probably get on board with that. Now you're talking about more complex life, which is the natural thing that would happen after a long period of time. Now you're having more complex organisms. So the question then becomes, how much time would go by for more complex life to occur? Let's say intelligent life. And I'm trying to think of which way I want to go. If I want to go to what Dr. Brandenburg said, let's go down Dr. Brandenburg's research with Xenon-129 and 132. Can you tell us what Xenon-129 and 132 is?
You're going right to the deep end, Matt.
We're going to the deep end.
Okay. Yes. Let me just show a picture of Brandenburg, if I may, here. Just to familiarize people with this guy. Because, look, we sit here and we throw out all these names, and what your listeners need to understand is that this research that is presented in the film, it's not by a bunch of crackpot people, okay? And here's one example. Here we have a PhD, a plasma physicist, he's worked with NASA before. He's worked at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories, Sandia National Labs. This guy knows his stuff. He's got so many credentials, but he's responsible for a variety of different discoveries. And you're asking about something that's not that well known, but it's the most important part of all of this. And in my opinion, it was the most compelling. It was the thing that essentially led me to make the film in the first place, because any one particular thing that we've been talking about, in my opinion, wasn't really enough to make a documentary out of, that make it interesting for the layperson. But here we have Dr. John Brandenburg, who one day back in the early 80s just was another curious individual, just like you and me. And he started looking at the data that was coming back from the Viking landers, the atmospheric data. It was just figuring out what kind of gases were there on Mars. And he's looking at the atmospheric data, and he's noticing some strange looking isotopic data. Now, what is isotopes? Okay. As an isotope is, it's an it is an atom, but it's with an extra nucleus, so it might be a little heavier. A hydrogen atom has one proton, but if you add a neutron to it, it's still hydrogen, but a different version of it. So there are some funny isotopes that are in the Martian atmosphere that present a quandary, because according to his research, there is no natural explanation for how these isotopes, and this one in particular, an isotope of the gas known as xenon. It's on the periodic table of elements. There's a gas known as xenon, and there's an isotope of Xenon-129 specifically that is abundant in the Martian atmosphere to such a degree that it presents as an anomaly in our solar system, because no other planetary body, there's nothing else in our solar system that has essentially this abundance of Xenon-129 in its atmosphere. And the problem that creates is that due to the abundance of this particular isotope of Xenon-129 in the Martian atmosphere, there is no natural explanation for how it got there.
So how did it get there, Brian? So let's parse this out for a second, just before we do this. So the xenon, I think, is 2.5 times, I think, is what you reported in the documentary, in the Martian atmosphere. And that's not, if that's right, that's not normal. Obviously, that's an abundance of this particular isotope. And do you want to tell people where we have, there's a couple other examples. I think supernova, I think, is one natural process. Is that right?
Yes. So you have to ask yourself, the question then becomes, what creates Xenon-129? And there are two processes that create Xenon-129. One of them is natural. You just mentioned it, a supernova, okay? So hypothetically speaking, if our sun were to go supernova, it would create a lot of Xenon-129 and place it everywhere in our solar system.
Right, you'd see it everywhere.
It would also destroy the solar system because the sun blew up. So one has to question, okay, did a nearby star blow up and only place this amount of Xenon-129 on Mars and nowhere else in our solar system? That's not really, that explanation doesn't hold water.
Doesn't seem likely.
Okay. And it then becomes a matter of examining the other explanation for how Xenon-129, the abundance of Xenon-129 in the Martian atmosphere. And this explanation is not easily received. It's not easily talked about. It's not easily received. And most people don't want to even attempt to try to understand this, or even, I'll just put it this way, it's frightening, because the only other method of producing Xenon-129 is by thermonuclear detonation.
And we have examples of this here on Earth. That's how we know that, correct? Because we detonated thermonuclear weapons in testing.
That's correct. Every time a nuclear weapon is detonated on Earth, it produces a variety of gases, including Xenon-129 and another one, Xenon-132. And they're able to see, if you chart it all out, you'll see a spike in Xenon-129 in the location that the bomb went off. And this spike, saying a thermonuclear weapon was just detonated here on Earth and producing this spike in Xenon-129, they can measure that on Earth, and that spike matches up with Mars. Pretty much exactly. So that's an uncomfortable thing to think about. It's hard to reconcile that, because we don't want to think about thermonuclear weapons being detonated on Mars. That opens up a whole can of worms. That's quite frightening. How do we grapple with that?
Yeah, we just spent 30 to 40 minutes talking about microbial life and crinoids. And then
Oh. Now we're sucker punching. Boom, we weren't expecting humans.
yeah, we basically just brought a very dangerous weapon to a nice conversation we were having about the possibility of life on Mars. But this is an important piece that you do present in the documentary. This evidence that Dr. John E. Brandenburg has presented, it's not new. He's had this out there for a while. I can imagine the absolute, what's the word I'm looking for? Rejection of this notion that would happen on Mars, even if it was in the very, very distant past. However, the evidence does point to this, and there is other evidence as well. Did they find trinitite in some of these locations on Mars?
Yes, and that's, thank you for asking. There's more to it than just the Xenon-129. There are other signatures, okay? And one of them, yes, is essentially what you could compare to trinitite, a natural glass. If lightning strikes the earth or sand or something, it creates glass. You superheat the soil, you superheat sand, it creates a natural glass. It doesn't look like our windows, but it is considered to be a natural glass. And the surface of Mars, there's natural glass essentially covering quite a large portion of it. In addition to that, the surface of Mars has shown that it was irradiated by fast-moving neutrons. Okay? Fast-moving neutrons. What does this mean? When we talk about the difference between a thermonuclear weapon versus a nuclear power plant, okay, they're using different physics, all right? And I can't go into the details here, but one is known as nuclear power plant here on Earth uses a process known as S process, S standing for slow moving neutrons. And the other one in the thermonuclear weapons is R process for rapid moving neutrons, okay? Their signatures are different, and the surface of Mars has evidence of R process, essentially fast-moving neutrons irradiating the soil, thus making the soil itself radioactive. And not everywhere, but in 3 distinct locations. There are 3 different radioactive hotspots on the surface of Mars. So all of this together, it starts to provide evidence something catastrophic happened here, and no natural process explains that. He did, first, to his credit, Brandenburg did try to argue that this was a natural process, but the data just didn't add up.
He was just following the data, and unfortunately, the news that he got when he followed the data was not a good story.
Yes, and I vetted this, okay? I contacted Lawrence Livermore, which is they're working on fusion, okay? I contacted JPL. I contacted a nuclear weapons expert from Georgia Tech. And I said, hey, what do you think of Brandenburg's research? And he's, yeah, I've heard of it, but he disagreed because he said that what most likely happened on Mars was similar to what happened millions of years ago here on Earth, in which there's a uranium mine over in the Africa, in a country known as Gabon. There's a uranium mine. It's called the Oklo uranium mines. And in millions of years ago, some water seeped into underground space with a lot of uranium and essentially started producing a natural nuclear reaction. Now, this type of natural nuclear reaction would not have produced that spike in xenon. It would not have produced the R process, okay? So it doesn't hold water. It's not the same type of nuclear reaction that produces the things that we find on Mars. And so I emailed the guy back at this PhD at Georgia Tech. I'm like, look, what you propose doesn't match the data coming from Mars. And of course, I never heard anything back. So it's a
Right.
scary thing for people to talk about. People don't want to lose their reputations, don't want to lose their
Right.
credibility. You get these scientists who, like John Brandenburg, thank God we have him sticking his neck out. He's the only one on Earth who ever published anything about this.
Right. He wrote a book.
Guy. So credit goes to him. We got to support him.
Yes, absolutely. And the other thing is, it's called Trinitype because of the Trinity test. So this is what they found there after they detonated these atomic bombs. So they know it's a byproduct of this activity. And if you're saying that water seeping into a uranium deposit is going to create Trinitite, I don't see how that happens. I think you need the explosion to do that. So yeah, okay. All right. So now we're in the deep end.
That's the best they got. And it doesn't match. So no one wants to have the debate with Brandenburg. They just prefer to ignore it.
It's not a happy conversation to have. And unfortunately, the data does point to that. Now that we're in the deep end, Brian, I'd like to go a little bit deeper with you if we can. And I'm glad you put this into the documentary because I have spoken to a couple of remote viewers and you bring this up. And this is a very interesting and fascinating aspect that is a phenomenon and has been utilized by the United States government. Most people watching this have probably heard of SRI and where this all kind of started in the US. But do you want to touch on the remote viewing aspect and what you touched on in the documentary with Joe McMoneagle?
Sure.
And Tom McNear too. Sorry, I didn't mean to leave it.
Yes, I'm essentially a newbie to this whole Mars disclosure movement. I'm only a couple years into it. So when I was getting back to my partner, Michael, in England, he knew all this stuff already, and he's just feeding it to me one step at a time. And one day he brought up this idea of remote viewing. We're talking about psychic abilities here, and its use within the United States Army back in the 80s under this secret program called Stargate. And I'm sitting here thinking, Jesus, this sounds nuts. I don't want to touch this at all. No way, no how. Then there's this one document that the CIA released a while back, and it's essentially a transcript from one of these remote viewing sessions where the remote viewer, in other words, the person with the psychic abilities, was describing aloud to the person next to him, his monitor, what he was seeing while performing the remote viewing. And what he saw, essentially, is quite frightening. It's tragic. And if you buy into this idea of remote viewing, which, by the way, has science behind it demonstrating its efficacy, it essentially supports all of the research published by John Brandenburg, in which there was a previous inhabited civilization on Mars. Something went sideways and destroyed the planet, leaving the inhabitants searching for a new place to live. So it gets that's a lot to take in. But what I found so compelling, Matt, was that it's not just a bunch of street corner psychics. We're talking about the United States military and them tasking their lieutenant colonel and their whole team. There's a secret classified team. They're tasking their team on Mars. And anytime you talk about the military, people respect the military. And whatever the military's doing, their ears perk up. Whoa, the military's doing that? Then there must be something to it. So I felt comfortable including it into the film because if the military's doing it, then people might take it more seriously.
Yeah, and the fact that they funded SRI and Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ started this back in the 70s, that these are facts. And like you said, they've done multiple experiments proving that the phenomenon is real and that it works. Why it works, how it works, the mental frameworks, they have some ideas on that, but they know that the experiments have proved that people can do this. And a couple of the guys you had on there were some of the best. Joe McMoneagle is well known. You can see some of the experiments they did with him. clear that he's done this. He did it on television multiple times in real time, and was blowing people away. So that's interesting that it works, but it's more interesting that they would take time and energy and resources to go remote view Mars, right?
Yes.
So there must have been some reason for that, some interest. And one of the things I think that Joe McMonagle reviewed over there was a massive pyramidal structure next to a crater, which is interesting because there's not only did he say that, but there's a photo of it from the orbiters, correct?
Yes.
Do you have a picture of that? Because I can pull it up if you don't have it. Or
I got it.
I think we should show people this.
Thank you for this because, Matt, that's right. Not only did he observe, okay, there was Joe McMonagle, who is essentially the most well-known remote viewer. I was lucky enough to personally interview a different remote viewer. His name is Tom McNair, who's a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. And both of them were tasked against, meaning assigned to view, one particular location on Mars, which is known as Crater Pyramid. It's exactly as you described. It is a pyramid that is directly adjacent to a 2.5 mile wide impact crater. Now, you might look at this and you think, what's the big deal? The big deal is that if there was any sort of geological feature, a mountain, a hill, whatever, in the direct area of where a meteor strikes and produces a 2.5 mile wide crater, one would then make the logical conclusion that how did it survive? One would think, how would that geological structure survive an impact of that magnitude? So
it's weird that it's there anyway, because there's nothing else like that around there. And then when you add this impact crater right next to it, I mean, it looks like it's touching it.
Yes.
You would assume it would have been obliterated.
So then, because it wasn't, then you might have to ask the next logical question. Then maybe was it constructed afterwards? Now we take a look at this. This is an old photograph, perhaps 25, 30 years old. But you can see it's not just a circular thing here. We're seeing lines. We're seeing sides to this thing. It's a very high contrast. It's not a very good photo, but it does show what appears to be. And the structure here is 1.7 miles wide. That's huge. So
1.7 miles wide.
Yes. So then you have to ask yourself, why was the U.S. Army interested in asking their remote viewers to look at this particular feature? One has to presume that there was something interesting going on here, enough for them to take notice and want to know a little bit more about it. Now, believe it or not, there was a more recent photograph of this taken. Here, we can see some better detail from it. See if I can blow it up a little bit. Ooh, that's a little too big. Let me go back down to 25%. So we can see it. Yeah, it's like it's touching the crater. But again, we can see these sides to it. This isn't a perfect geometrical shape, but you have to remind yourself that the surface of Mars is at a minimum millions of years old, perhaps even billions. So what would anything look like after millions or billions of years of erosion or sediment deposition, winds blowing stuff around? What would an unexcavated pyramid look like? What do unexcavated pyramids look like here on Earth? They look like a big hill. It's not until you clear away all the soil and the plants and the trees and the shrubbery that you find the pristine pyramid underneath. What's interesting, Matt, and I didn't present this in the film, there's been so much that I've learned since the film came out, which is why I continue to do interviews for my YouTube channel. But I'm in touch with a lot of these guys who continue to find anomalies like this. And I'd like to mention a few of them now.
Yeah.
One of them His name is Gary Legier. I do have him in the film, but I don't have it with me. But I do plan to interview him later this year and showcase a lot of what he has found. But he has found other pyramidal shapes, shall we say, directly next to craters. One looked so, again, we're talking about things with sides. It's not a volcano's round. Okay, it doesn't have
Right.
sides. It's round. It's not a mountain range. And like you said a moment ago, there's nothing else like it in the area. It's just a one and done sort of thing. So we have photographic evidence that there's more things like this. Now, what are the chances, Matt, that there's a pyramid or pyramidal shape? Let's just be basic about it. A pyramidal shape directly next to an impact crater, multiple occasions on Mars. How does nature do something like that?
I don't know. It doesn't seem like something like I know nature does lots of weird things. And I know there are examples of mountains that can sometimes look like pyramids, although they are mountains. The problem is they're not sitting next to a 2-mile wide crater that most likely would have obliterated everything in the area if some large celestial object came torpedoing down. So that's a problem. And then you have to add in that it does look like there are cornered off sides a little bit. And if this is millions, if not tens to hundreds of million years old, we don't know. The only way to know is to go there and inspect this stuff. But again, another large piece to the puzzle. Remote viewers looking at this thing, they've got a photo of it. What type of intelligence have they gathered around this very anomalous structure?
Matt, may I share another image?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so let's just say you or your viewers aren't convinced by that image. Not a problem. There's dozens more, and here's one of the most compelling ones. And this was discovered by another one of these independent Mars researchers. His name is Jean Ward from South Africa. The image on the left is a structure on Mars that's about 2.5 miles big, which is
Jeez.
we see something here on Earth that arguably, if you add, okay, we see this pyramid of the moon, which is in Mexico.
Teotihuacan.
Okay, you add a bunch of soil on top of that, and you tell me that's not going to look like what's on the left.
Yeah, it's again, you're seeing angled sides, and I know Mother Nature does sometimes do funny things, but it looks pretty symmetrical, and it's very big. Now, the other problem you have is when things start to get very large. Look at the Great Pyramid, for example. Like things start to get a little wonky as they get bigger, but the Great Pyramid is very perfect and symmetrical, and it's huge. You would think that if something's natural, it's going to be a little more wonky the bigger it is. And this is, how big is this one?
I think that at least 2 miles big.
Uh-huh.
But remember, this is Mars with much lower gravity. So is it any surprise that things could be essentially just bigger there? But yeah, like what you just said, we need boots on the ground to go inspect this stuff. People there with shovels, and let's start digging this stuff up, because when someone says there is absolutely no evidence for archaeological structures on the surface of Mars, I'm simply saying we have plenty of photographs discovered by independent Mars researchers. Now, I'm going to say that NASA takes photos and they publish them, but they don't add any commentary. They don't add any analysis. They just don't say anything, because when anomalous things like this come up, if they were to say anything, that opens up a whole can of worms. So they just leave that to the public to do. People like Gary Legier, people like Jean Ward are going through in their spare time thousands of images. They do this every single day. This is what they devote their life to. And Jesus, you got to credit these guys for their perseverance.
Yes.
their dedication to this, and they find these gems for us to enjoy. They say, look at this. Doesn't this look funny? What will NASA say? NASA will say, there's nothing to see here. And in my opinion, are we not using common sense? You're going to say, absolutely, there is nothing to see here? And I'm like, look, I'm not saying proof, Matt. I'm saying evidence. And guess what? Photographs are evidence.
And is the problem, let's say, for example, there's enough groundswell of interest around this, and and then the tide starts to swing a little bit, and then all of a sudden they're saying maybe there is something there, maybe we should go check it out. Is the problem getting people there, or is the problem funding to get people there? Because right now we're sending robots there, rovers there, taking pictures, things like that. Does it change if you send people there? Did you go over any of that with anybody?
There's a swell of support these days for the colonization aspect. Credit goes to Elon Musk for as divisive a figure he is these days. You got to give the man credit for changing industries. Jesus, I applaud him for that. But he is now literally designing rockets to specifically send humans to Mars. Something that NASA should have been doing all these years. Instead decided, you know what? Okay, Matt, we have to speculate a little bit here, because the question is, why didn't NASA follow up on Viking, go back and either confirm or deny those microbial life results? Okay. Why didn't we take a look at these photographs of what appear to be pyramids and send people there to start digging them up, using our common sense and saying, look, if they aren't pyramids, that's valuable to know also, because then we have evidence of nature producing what appear to be perfectly symmetrical pyramids. So there's value in knowing one way or the other. But it's taken us nearly 50 years to get the public's interest back focused on Mars. Now, arguably, it's not. Okay, it is mostly related to sending humans there, which is good, but we want to occupy Mars and maybe terraform it. So those are the more prominent discussions happening these days. So I think our best hope is to piggyback on those conversations that are happening and introduce the subject of, okay, let's not only send people there to colonize, but let's send a team of scientists, not just geologists to study rocks, but we need to send biologists, we need to send paleontologists, we need to send archaeologists to perform all of these different disciplines of science to accurately get a comprehensive picture of the history of this planet. Because Mars, the reason why we titled the film Blue Planet Red was because Mars was a blue planet just like Earth is, but it was a blue planet a lot earlier than Earth. So if one follows, the logic, if it had water on it, an ocean, and a thick atmosphere, breathable atmosphere, you have to think where there's water, we find life, because that's usually what happens now. Where you find water, you find life. Even in the most saltiest conditions here on Earth, directly in ice, you'll find microbes living. Okay, there's certain microbes that have a natural ability to create essentially antifreeze and melt the ice around them and extract the nutrients from the ice. So microbes can live in ice. Why should we expect the harsh conditions of the Martian atmosphere to be inhospitable to life entirely when we find microbial life in the most extreme environments here on Earth, where we never really used to expect to find it? There is this, what I hope to achieve, Matt, is driving the public's awareness towards these scientists, towards these independent researchers, because they're the ones doing the hard work for you and I to enjoy, for you and I to derive a picture of what this planet has to offer beyond it just being red.
Yeah, Like I said, Brian, you did a fantastic job with the documentary. I have so many more questions, but I think we should probably wrap this up. And if you'd be open to doing a part two,
Oh,
I'd
sure.
do that with
Yeah,
you.
of course.
But maybe just one more question before we wrap it up.
Yes.
What are the implications of a widespread understanding? And this is a big question. What are the implications of a widespread understanding among the human population on Earth that not only is there probably most likely microbial life on the planet Mars now, but possibly there was intelligent life and more complex life long ago? What is the implication of that? And how does that change the way people see themselves on Earth? I know that's a big question.
Yeah, it's a very relevant question, and it's one that we ask towards the end of the film. If the planet gave rise to life, intelligent life, which is no longer there, the question is why? What happened to the planet? And then you have to ask, could what happened there happen here? And if there were other humanoid-like inhabitants on our next door neighbor millions or perhaps billions of years ago, isn't it sad that they're no longer with us? What happened? This is almost, it's like Star Wars, but in real life. It's like Star Trek, but in real life. Like we have planetary disasters wiping out entire civilizations of intelligent species. What makes us think that it couldn't happen here? And since we talked about Brandenburg's research, I'll challenge anybody to, rather, I'll ask anybody, whoever has seen Oppenheimer, there's a one part in the film where you have Matt Damon's character talking to Cillian Murphy, who's Oppenheimer, asking him what the probability is of them doing the first Trinity test and them igniting the atmosphere, thus destroying all life on Earth. This was a serious question. And the response was near zero. There's a near zero chance, not entirely zero, but you essentially, it is an important question to ask, but fortunately the Trinity test did not have the power necessary to ignite the atmosphere. But what Dr. Brandenburg's research shows is that the amount of energy that the evidence demonstrates that was essentially produced from this catastrophic thermonuclear detonation was stronger 10 to 100 times the amount of energy that the Chicxulub meteor created when it impacted Earth 65 million years ago and killed the dinosaurs. And to get an idea about how big of a bomb that is, he actually did the math and said, you need a bomb the size of the Empire State Building. And that's what the evidence shows. So, Matt, that's frightening. Did they do this to themselves? We talk about nuclear winter and Armageddon, and you have Vladimir Putin talking about the use of nuclear weapons and Kim Jong-un talking about nuclear weapons. Are they out of their mind? Like, we do not want to destroy ourselves. But if it wasn't them destroying themselves, then who was it?
Big questions.
And that's frightening. So it would be helpful to know for certain, one way or another, if in fact that's what happened, because that's what the evidence shows, because we need to better prepare ourselves for what is really going on here, Matt. We have this oasis, this beautiful oasis Earth here that we all live on. But if our next door neighbor shows a catastrophic event that was brought upon by an intelligent species, Lord Almighty, we need to understand exactly what that was so we can better prepare ourselves for the future.
Well said, Brian. I agree with you wholeheartedly. This was another fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your work with me and my audience. It's a fantastic documentary. Tell people how they can find you, find the documentary. Where can we find this?
Thank you, Matt. Yes, the documentary Matt, of course, you got to see an advanced copy, but it is now in the hands of a distributor because it will, later this year, it will be included on a variety of streaming platforms, ones you've heard of, ones you haven't. That's all being worked out right now. They're getting all the legal and marketing materials prepared, but it's all happening right now behind the scenes. So at some point, we'll have a release date for the film. For anyone interested, I can tell you a Blu-ray copy privately for now. But since the film has come out, Matt, I have continued to do this work. I have a YouTube channel, so you can find everything you need to know about the film and about the continuing work since the film has come out on the website, blueplanetred.net. Okay, you can also find me on Twitter at Brian Corey Dobbs. On YouTube, same thing, at Brian Corey Dobbs. And I post quite a bit, and feel free to reach out and start a conversation.
Awesome. That was great, Brian. So everybody go check that out as soon as it's available. And if you wanted an advanced copy, get a hold of Brian, his contact details he just told you about. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you, Matt.